What do you think is at play here? Cabinet ministers are contradicting the president. There's a blame game by the ministers who are busy, throwing each other under the bus. Are these, once again, signs of ANC politics and divisions spilling into government?
Yeah, thanks for having me. I think it does kind of show that. But more importantly, it makes what happened last week more unsurprising. Right, that the security cluster that works within cabinet is just not on the same page about protecting the nation. It's first and foremost responsibility, and you can now start seeing these cracks forming, right? So it now makes a lot more sense that the intelligence agencies, security, the police, defense were not working hand in hand in protecting the country. What makes the situation even worse is now people now need to be held accountable. And in that desperate clinging on to power, you have people essentially throwing mud at each other. And I think what needs to happen in order to stop this and to stop the internal fighting that may be coming from the ANC, but maybe just be people fighting for their own political survival, is the commander-in-chief of the country sorting out the governance structures within cabinet. Because at the end of the day, that's his primary responsibility. So we can quibble about all these fights and the contradictory statements, but there's one person in charge who's responsible for the governance of these clusters.
What options are available for the president? The country is rebuilding after last week's events, but the president, the argument there is that there must also be something that's done on the side of the president, right? He also has a task of rebuilding confidence in his government. So where does he start?
Yeah, so there's been many calls about removing ministers in different ways, and I think there's a lot of value in those calls, but we must also become very reticent about it, that if there was indeed an insurrection that happened, one of the last things you want to do is essentially cull your security cluster by removing ministers and just replacing them, right? So there is that hesitancy that you have to be aware of. I think what's more important that the president needs to do is that you have to have a very honest conversation about the intelligence services in the country. It has now been extremely well documented that the intelligence services of the country have been dismembered, taken apart, and not working at full capacity. And this has been a project that's been undertaken for the past 15 years now. So even before the Zuma presidency years, this has been a task that's been undertaken for almost 2 decades. And the question is, this is now the end result. If you want to build confidence in the country, outside of the social cohesion, outside of the economic interventions, the president's first point of departure should be, how do I fix the intelligence services of my country to ensure that this doesn't happen again? And if it does happen again, that we are better prepared for that situation. And I think that's first and foremost to build the confidence of cabinet to do its job. If cabinet doesn't have the confidence that it's capable of doing its job, then everything else will fall off the map.
But what responsibility does the president take? He appointed these people in these critical departments, the same people he says failed to prepare for what happened and didn't even have the capabilities to respond swiftly. Or does he somehow escape scot-free?
Yeah, so it seems as if the public mood is moving towards the president's favor. But I think a lot of accountability has to be put on his shoulders. So if we take him not just as the head of the state, but as the commander-in-chief, and the president comes out and says there has been an insurrection that happened in the country, you as the commander-in-chief have to take responsibility for that. You have delegated responsibilities to particular cabinet ministers, but at the end of the day, you have to take responsibility of that. Right, so the president has to be held accountable in one way or another. Now, obviously, there is no structure that will do that outside of Parliament, and Parliament can really set up a committee that can look into this, to look into the intelligence services, but that doesn't work in our political dispensation, right? So there's no real tool to hold the president accountable until we get to the next elections, et cetera, et cetera. But I think a huge amount of responsibility needs to be put on the president's shoulders, and I think the president is aware of that. I think the president is aware, if we had to use the phrase, had egg on his face at the beginning of last week. He got very bad intelligence, he got very bad information, and you can see about how he even had to backtrack on his own statements that he made at the beginning of last week and change them on this over the past weekend. So you can see that the president is getting bad information. You can see that the president is trying to rectify the mistakes of the past. The question is whether our cabinet ministers are willing to do the exact same thing, or whether they'll be caught up in infighting amongst themselves.